From our earliest moments of self-awareness, a single question haunts human consciousness. What is the meaning of life? This isn't merely a philosophical curiosity, but a desperate existential need that drives much of human behavior. We join religions, build careers, start families, create art, pursue knowledge, fight for causes, amass wealth, all in service to this relentless quest for meaning. The search seems so fundamentally human that we rarely question its premise, that life must have some inherent purpose waiting to be discovered or created. So universal is this assumption that those who question it are often viewed with suspicion or pity, as though they've failed to grasp something essential about human existence. Yet what if this very quest, this desperate need to find meaning, is itself the most profound illusion? What if the assumption that life should have meaning is not a deep insight, but a psychological crutch? Consider the curious pattern that appears whenever meaning is discussed. No matter what ultimate purpose someone claims to have discovered, whether religious salvation, service to others, pursuit of knowledge, or creative expression, that meaning always conveniently aligns with distinctly human values and concerns. The universe somehow always turns out to have a purpose that validates human existence in human terms. Isn't this correlation suspiciously convenient? More tellingly, observe what happens when someone's sense of meaning collapses. When a religious person loses faith, when a parent loses a child, when a lifelong goal proves unattainable or empty upon achievement. The response isn't merely sadness, but existential crisis. This disproportionate reaction suggests something beyond ordinary disappointment. It reveals our psychological dependency on the belief that life must have purpose. We react not just to specific loss, but to the terrifying glimpse of a universe indifferent to our need for meaning. This pattern appears with such consistency that it suggests something fundamental about how meaning functions in human psychology. A 19th century philosopher, writing amid personal suffering and isolation, developed a revolutionary perspective that might explain this pattern. His insight wasn't merely that particular meanings might be illusions, but that the very quest for meaning itself might be a psychological response to an existence that fundamentally has none. This wasn't an expression of despair, but a recognition that might open the possibility of a different relationship with existence, one based not on demanding that life justify itself through purpose, but on embracing its unfolding without requiring justification at all. What if meaning isn't something to find or create, but a concept to transcend? What if the truly profound question isn't what is life's purpose, but why do we assume life needs one? And what if the fixation on meaning actually prevents us from experiencing a deeper, more direct engagement with existence, one that accepts life as a pure happening that requires no external validation? The implications would transform not just philosophical understanding, but our fundamental relationship with being alive. I invite you to consider a perspective so radical that religious and philosophical authorities have consistently misinterpreted it, not because it's complicated, but because it threatens our most comforting assumption. What if the problem isn't that we haven't found the right meaning, but that we keep insisting life must have one at all? What if the path to genuine liberation isn't discovering purpose, but releasing the demand that existence provide one? Let's examine a puzzling, pattern that emerges across human experience, one that suggests something deeply counterintuitive about meaning itself. When people claim to have discovered life's purpose, whether through religion, philosophy, or personal insight, they typically report a sense of peace and fulfillment. Yet curiously, this state rarely lasts. The history of spiritual and philosophical seeking shows a consistent cycle. Meaning is discovered, certainty and satisfaction follow, then doubt and emptiness gradually return, initiating another search. This pattern repeats not just across individuals, but within individual lives, with each new, final answer eventually revealing itself as insufficient. Consider religious conversion experiences. Initially, the convert reports profound certainty about life's meaning. The universe finally makes sense through their newfound faith. Yet religious texts and communities devote enormous energy to addressing recurring doubt, suggesting this initial certainty regularly fades. Similarly, philosophical systems promising to reveal life's purpose initially satisfy their adherents, only to spawn new questions and competing systems addressing the original philosophy's limitations. Even personal meanings like family, creative work, or service to others follow this pattern. Moments of feeling, "this is enough," alternating with renewed emptiness and questioning. This cycle appears too consistent to be coincidental. If meaning was something that could actually be discovered or created, why would it prove so consistently unstable? Why would even the most profound sense of purpose require constant maintenance and reinforcement? This pattern suggests something fundamental about the nature of meaning itself. Not that we haven't found the right purpose, but that purpose might function more as a psychological palliative than an achievable state or discoverable truth. Another anomaly appears when we observe those rare individuals who claim to have transcended the need for meaning altogether. Across traditions, certain mystics, philosophers, and artists describe not finding ultimate purpose, but releasing the demand for it, and report not despair, but extraordinary liberation. Zen masters speak of no meaning beyond this moment. Certain existentialist philosophers describe freedom emerging precisely from accepting life's fundamental purposelessness. Some artists report their deepest work flowing not from understanding life's meaning, but from surrendering to its inherent meaninglessness. These accounts describe not nihilistic despair, but an almost ecstatic engagement with existence, precisely because the burden of meaning has been set aside. This contradicts our intuitive assumption that meaninglessness leads to depression or emptiness. If purposelessness naturally produces despair, why do these individuals report the opposite? Why does release from meaning-seeking sometimes create not emptiness but a more direct and vital engagement with existence? This pattern suggests our fundamental assumption about meaninglessness might be profoundly mistaken. Most tellingly, observe what happens during experiences of peak aliveness, moments of intense creativity, intimacy, natural beauty, or physical exhilaration. During these experiences, the question of life's meaning typically disappears completely. We don't pause during profound love, creative flow, or breathtaking natural beauty to ask, "But what does this mean?" The question becomes irrelevant precisely when life feels most alive. Yet afterward, meaning-seeking returns, suggesting it functions as a response to diminished vitality rather than as a path to greater aliveness. These anomalies converge on a disturbing possibility. What if meaning isn't something missing from existence that must be discovered or created, but a psychological construct that emerges specifically to compensate for moments when we're disconnected from direct experience? What if the search for purpose is not the highest human activity, but a symptom of having lost something more fundamental, immediate engagement with the raw fact of being alive? And which philosopher saw this pattern with such clarity that his insight has been consistently misinterpreted as nihilism when it might actually offer the path to life's most profound affirmation? In 1881, Friedrich Nietzsche found himself in a small rented room in the Swiss mountain village of Sils Maria. His health was deteriorating. Debilitating migraines, severe digestive problems, and failing eyesight had forced him to resign his university position. Isolated, physically suffering, and facing financial uncertainty, Nietzsche entered what would become his most creatively fertile period. It was here, amid physical pain and existential precariousness, that he developed his revolutionary insights about meaning and meaninglessness, insights born not from abstract theorizing, but from direct confrontation with existence at its most challenging. What positioned Nietzsche uniquely to see what others couldn't was his unusual personal journey. Raised in a deeply religious household, his father was a Lutheran pastor, he had experienced firsthand the psychological function of religious meaning-making. Yet, unlike mere skeptics who rejected religion without understanding its deeper psychological purpose, Nietzsche recognized that religion answered a fundamental human need, providing cosmic justification for existence. His question wasn't whether religious meaning was factually true, but what its psychological function revealed about human nature. This combination of intimate familiarity with meaning systems and critical distance from them allowed him to recognize patterns that others missed. During his daily walks through the alpine landscape, when his health permitted, Nietzsche contemplated a question that few had asked directly. Why do humans seek meaning at all? Rather than assuming this quest was natural or inevitable, he examined it as a psychological phenomenon with historical origins and specific functions. This approach led to a revolutionary insight. What if the search for meaning wasn't a response to life's inherent meaninglessness, but a symptom of a particular relationship with existence, one characterized by diminished vitality and fear of life's inherent emptiness? In his notes from this period, later published as The Gay Science, Nietzsche wrote, "It is only the charm of ignorance about oneself that makes the search for meaning seductive." This wasn't mere cynicism, but an observation based on careful analysis of how meaning systems function psychologically. He recognized that the demand for purpose emerges most strongly when direct engagement with life weakens, creating a compensatory psychological mechanism that substitutes abstract meaning for immediate experience. This insight wasn't a rejection of meaning, but a recognition of its actual psychological function, not as a discovery about existence, but as a response to a particular way of experiencing it. What distinguished Nietzsche's analysis from mere nihilism was his recognition that transcending the need for meaning didn't lead to despair, but potentially to a more profound affirmation of existence. During those solitary mountain walks, he began developing what he called amor fati, love of fate, an approach to life that accepts its inherent meaninglessness not as a tragic flaw to be remedied, but as the very condition that allows genuine freedom and creativity. This wasn't about creating new meaning, but about developing a relationship with existence that no longer demanded meaning as a prerequisite for affirmation. In his personal letters from this period, Nietzsche described moments of what he called Dionysian affirmation, experiences where the absence of inherent meaning became not a source of despair, but the foundation for a more direct and ecstatic engagement with life. These weren't abstract philosophical positions, but lived experiences emerging from his confrontation with suffering and isolation. Having faced both physical pain and the collapse of conventional meaning systems, he discovered something unexpected, that beyond meaning-seeking lay not emptiness, but a more immediate and vital relationship with existence itself. As Nietzsche walked along the shores of Lake Silvaplana, he was developing insights about meaning that wouldn't merely offer another philosophical position, but would challenge the very premise of how humans had related to existence. What if the problem isn't that we haven't found the right meaning, but that the quest for meaning itself reflects a fundamental misunderstanding of what life is and how we might most profoundly engage with it? Nietzsche's first compelling evidence appears in his analysis of how the concept of meaning evolved historically. In The Genealogy of Morals, he traces the development of purpose-seeking from primitive cultures to modern societies, revealing a consistent pattern. As direct engagement with life's immediate challenges diminishes, the demand for abstract meaning increases. Early human societies focused primarily on practical concerns, food, shelter, protection, with minimal emphasis on cosmic purpose. Abstract meaning emerged gradually alongside increased security and distance from immediate survival pressures, suggesting it functions as a response to diminished engagement with life's direct challenges rather than as a discovery about existence's inherent nature. Consider the historical evidence. Ancient Greek culture, despite sophisticated philosophical traditions, placed relatively little emphasis on cosmic purpose compared to later Christian civilization. Homer's epics depict heroes concerned with glory, excellence, and fate, not universal meaning. Early Buddhist teachings explicitly warned against metaphysical speculation about life's purpose, focusing instead on direct experience. It was primarily through religions like Christianity and philosophical systems responding to existential security that meaning became a central preoccupation. This historical pattern supports Nietzsche's insight that meaning-seeking intensifies as immediate engagement with life's challenges diminishes. The evidence extends beyond historical development to how meaning functions psychologically. Nietzsche documented how thoroughly meaning systems serve psychological needs rather than reflecting objective discoveries. Religious meanings invariably make humans central to cosmic purpose, with moral frameworks that validate specifically human concerns. Philosophical systems claiming to reveal life's objective meaning consistently reflect their creators' psychological dispositions and cultural contexts. Even supposedly scientific purposes like evolutionary progress ultimately smuggle in human values under the guise of objectivity. This consistent pattern, where meaning always conveniently aligns with human needs, suggests we're not discovering purpose, but creating psychological constructs that ease existential anxiety. Literary evidence provides another layer of confirmation. Analyzing texts from different traditions, Nietzsche identified a recurring pattern. The most vital literary characters, those who embody the greatest life affirmation, rarely concern themselves with abstract meaning. From Greek tragedy to Shakespeare, the most compelling figures engage directly with life's challenges without requiring cosmic justification. By contrast, characters preoccupied with finding life's purpose typically appear hesitant, diminished in vitality, or unable to act decisively. This pattern in artistic representation reflects something fundamental about how meaning-seeking functions in relation to life engagement. Perhaps most revealing is the evidence from mystical traditions across cultures. Nietzsche collected accounts from contemplative practitioners who, after years of seeking meaning through spiritual frameworks, experienced a fundamental shift, not finding ultimate purpose, but transcending the need for it entirely. Zen teachings describe Satori as the release from meaning-seeking into direct experience. Certain Sufi mystics report stages beyond even divine purpose into the station of no station. Christian mystics, like Meister Eckhart, speak of moving beyond even God as a source of meaning into the desert of Godhead, where all purposes dissolve. These accounts describe not nihilistic despair, but extraordinary liberation and more immediate engagement with existence. This cross-cultural pattern is particularly significant because it emerges independently across traditions otherwise divergent in their teachings. The consistent description of spiritual maturity as involving the transcendence rather than fulfillment of meaning-seeking suggests something fundamental about the relationship between purpose and human experience. Not that meaning awaits discovery, but that the entire framework of meaning-seeking itself might be a preliminary stage rather than the culmination of human development. All these evidence streams converge on a revolutionary conclusion. Meaning isn't something missing from existence that must be discovered or created, but a psychological response to a particular way of relating to life, one characterized by diminished direct engagement. If Nietzsche is correct, then authentic liberation might come not from finding purpose, but from transcending the very framework that demands purpose as a prerequisite for affirming existence. To understand why the quest for meaning might be a psychological construct rather than a response to existence's true nature, we must examine what Nietzsche called the psychology of meaning-making. This process begins not with cosmic reality, but with a specific human experience, the encounter with suffering and mortality without immediate practical demands consuming attention. When primitive survival needs are met but consciousness has developed to recognize death's inevitability and life's apparent randomness, a particular anxiety emerges. The meaning-making impulse arises specifically as a response to this anxiety, providing psychological structure for experiences that might otherwise overwhelm human cognitive capacities. This meaning creation follows predictable patterns that Nietzsche identified across cultures. First comes the experience of existential uncertainty, the recognition that suffering occurs, death is inevitable, and the universe seems indifferent to human concerns. Next arises anxiety in response to this uncertainty, a psychological discomfort with existence's apparent chaotic nature. Then emerges the creative response, constructing frameworks that impose order, purpose, and justification onto this chaos. The final stage involves universalizing this constructed meaning, transforming a psychological coping mechanism into a supposedly objective truth about reality. This process isn't conscious deception, but a natural psychological response to existential anxiety. Nietzsche documented this pattern in religious and philosophical systems across traditions. When existential security allows attention to shift from immediate survival to broader questions about life's nature, meaning systems invariably emerge that transform chaos into order, randomness into purpose, and mortality into cosmic significance. This pattern appears too consistently to be coincidental, suggesting that meaning functions primarily as a psychological response to certain existential conditions rather than as a discovery about life's inherent nature. The evidence becomes even more compelling when examining how meaning systems respond to challenges. Nietzsche observed that when confronted with contradictory evidence or competing frameworks, meaning systems typically resort to specific defensive mechanisms. Reinterpretation of contradictions as actually supporting the system, dismissal of challenges as missing the deeper truth, or claims that the system operates on a level beyond rational examination. These defensive patterns appear across otherwise diverse traditions, suggesting they serve psychological functions rather than reflecting objective discoveries about reality. Modern psychological research substantially confirms Nietzsche's insights. Studies show that humans instinctively impose meaning on random events, perceive patterns in chaos, and create narratives to explain experiences, even when objectively no pattern exists. This tendency intensifies during periods of uncertainty or perceived threat. People with stronger meaning frameworks show greater psychological resilience, but sometimes at the cost of cognitive flexibility and accurate perception of reality. This psychological pattern supports Nietzsche's understanding that meaning functions primarily as a response to existential anxiety, rather than as a discovery about existence itself. What's particularly significant about this evidence is how it explains both the persistence of meaning-seeking and its ultimate instability. If meaning is a psychological construct, rather than a discoverable truth about reality, we would expect precisely the pattern we observe: temporary satisfaction followed by renewed doubt, leading to either reinforcement of existing frameworks or construction of new ones. This explains why even the most comprehensive meaning systems require constant maintenance, and why existential questioning tends to recur throughout life rather than being permanently resolved through discovery of true purpose. This understanding doesn't deny that meaning systems provide real psychological benefits. Nietzsche acknowledged that religious and philosophical frameworks offer genuine consolation, community, and direction that serve important human needs. But he distinguished between recognizing their psychological utility and mistaking them for discoveries about existence's inherent nature. The question isn't whether meaning systems work psychologically, but whether what they claim about reality's inherent purposefulness corresponds to anything beyond human psychological needs. Nietzsche's analysis reveals that what makes meaning-seeking so persistent isn't its connection to objective truth, but its function as a sophisticated psychological response to existential anxiety. By recognizing this function, we gain the possibility of relating to existence differently, not by finding better meanings, but by developing the capacity to engage with life directly, without requiring the psychological mediation that meaning systems provide. As we assemble the evidence, a consistent pattern emerges that Nietzsche articulated in "Thus Spoke Zarathustra," but that has been consistently misinterpreted by those seeking to incorporate his insights into existing meaning frameworks. What he called the Great Liberation isn't about finding better meanings, but recognizing the entire meaning-seeking impulse as a particular stage in human development, one that potentially gives way to a more direct and vital engagement with existence without the mediating framework of purpose. The pattern begins with how humans typically relate to meaninglessness. Across cultures, Nietzsche observed a consistent tendency to experience purposelessness as frightening and unbearable, a void to be filled rather than an opening to be explored. This reaction isn't natural or inevitable, but reflects a specific relationship with existence, characterized by the demand that life justify itself through purpose. The intensity of this reaction, the way meaninglessness produces not merely disappointment, but existential crisis, reveals something fundamental. Meaning functions not as a discovery about reality, but as a psychological defense against experiencing reality directly in its inherent emptiness. At the psychological level, the pattern continues with what Nietzsche called the transvaluation of emptiness. Religious and philosophical systems consistently transform the direct experience of life's inherent meaninglessness from something threatening into something meaningful in itself. Religious traditions interpret existential emptiness as spiritual testing, divine mystery, or the prelude to revelation. Philosophical systems reframe purposelessness as itself revealing something profound about existence. These interpretive moves serve psychological purposes. transforming the anxiety-provoking direct experience of meaninglessness into another form of meaning, thereby avoiding the more fundamental confrontation with existence that meaninglessness might otherwise initiate. The historical pattern reveals itself in how cultures respond to meaninglessness. When traditional meaning systems collapse through scientific advances, cultural exchange, or internal contradictions, societies typically respond not by embracing meaninglessness, but by rapidly constructing new meaning frameworks. Ancient polytheism gives way to monotheism, religious cosmology to scientific progress narratives, traditional values to political ideologies. The specific content changes while the psychological function remains, providing purpose to shield consciousness from direct encounter with existence's inherent emptiness. This consistent historical response suggests that meaning-seeking itself reflects a particular stage of development rather than an inevitable or final relationship with existence. Perhaps most revealing is the pattern Nietzsche identified in how individuals develop through different relationships with meaning. He observed a typical progression: initial unconscious immersion in inherited meaning systems, followed by their questioning or collapse, leading to a desperate search for new or better meanings. But beyond this familiar pattern lies a potential further development that few reach: the capacity to engage with life's inherent meaninglessness, not as a problem to be solved, but as the very condition that allows genuine freedom and creativity. This developmental trajectory suggests that meaning-seeking itself might be a transitional stage rather than the pinnacle of human relationship with existence. The pattern extends to how meaning systems respond to the possibility of meaninglessness. Nietzsche documented how religious and philosophical traditions consistently present meaninglessness as the worst possible condition, the ultimate existential failure to be avoided at all costs. This universal negative framing serves a specific function. It prevents exploration of what might actually lie beyond the meaning-seeking impulse itself. By defining meaninglessness exclusively as despair, emptiness, or nihilistic depression, meaning systems effectively prevent consideration of the possibility that transcending the demand for meaning might lead to something more profound than meaning could provide. What makes this pattern particularly difficult to recognize is how thoroughly it has shaped the very language and concepts through which we understand existence. The assumption that life must have purpose to be worthwhile is embedded in our most basic frameworks for understanding experience. This makes Nietzsche's insight so challenging. It questions not just particular meanings, but the entire premise that meaning-seeking represents the highest or most authentic relationship with existence. The pattern remains invisible precisely because we attempt to understand it through the very meaning frameworks it calls into question. The implications of Nietzsche's analysis extend far beyond academic philosophy into the practical reality of how we relate to existence. If meaning is primarily a psychological construct, rather than a discoverable truth about reality, then many of our basic assumptions about human development and fulfillment require fundamental reconsideration. This isn't merely a theoretical concern, but has profound consequences for how we approach our own lives and potential. First, we must confront what Nietzsche called the great inversion, the possibility that what we've considered the highest human activity, seeking meaning, might actually be a preliminary stage rather than the culmination of development. When meaning-seeking is recognized as a psychological response to existential anxiety rather than the definitive human relationship with existence, new possibilities emerge. Perhaps authentic development involves not better meaning-making, but developing the capacity to engage with life directly, without requiring the psychological mediation that meaning provides. This doesn't mean abandoning practical purposes, but transcending the demand that existence itself must have cosmic justification beyond its own happening. The psychological implications are equally significant. If the quest for meaning functions primarily as a response to diminished vitality and direct engagement with life, then the path to psychological well-being might look radically different than commonly assumed. Rather than constructing more comprehensive meaning frameworks, genuine psychological health might involve developing greater capacity to engage with experience directly, embracing life's inherent meaninglessness not as a problem to be solved, but as the very condition that allows authentic freedom and creativity. This suggests a fundamental reorientation of psychological approaches, away from helping people construct better meanings and toward building capacity to engage with life without the mediating framework of cosmic purpose. For relationships and community, the implications are particularly challenging. If meaning systems function primarily as psychological constructs rather than discoveries about reality, then the basis for shared values and purpose requires rethinking. Communities organized around shared meaning frameworks, whether religious, political, or philosophical, typically treat those frameworks as reflecting truth rather than serving psychological functions. A Nietzschean perspective suggests that more authentic community might emerge not from shared belief in particular meanings, but from mutual recognition of meaning's psychological nature and shared commitment to life affirmation beyond the need for cosmic justification. This requires a fundamental shift in how we understand the basis for human connection and cooperation. Perhaps most profound is the implication for how we understand freedom itself. If meaning-seeking reflects a particular relationship with existence characterized by the demand that life justify itself through purpose, then genuine freedom might involve liberation, not just from restrictive meanings, but from the very demand for meaning altogether. Nietzsche suggested that what he called the free spirit isn't someone who has discovered better meanings, but someone who has developed the capacity to affirm existence without requiring it to have purpose beyond its own unfolding. This reconceived freedom isn't arbitrary or nihilistic, but reflects a more direct and vital engagement with life, unmediated by the psychological constructs that meaning systems provide. This doesn't mean abandoning all structures or practical purposes, but relating to them differently, recognizing them as useful human constructions rather than reflections of cosmic truth, and holding them lightly rather than depending on them for existential justification. The truly free individual, in Nietzsche's view, isn't someone who has discovered life's true meaning, but someone who has developed the capacity to create values while simultaneously recognizing their created nature, maintaining what he called the innocence of becoming, rather than the desperate search for cosmic validation. These implications suggest a radical but liberating possibility. What if the path to the most profound engagement with existence requires not better meaning-seeking, but the courage to face life directly in its inherent meaninglessness? What if the capacity to affirm existence without demanding it justify itself through purpose represents not nihilistic despair, but the highest expression of life affirmation possible for human consciousness? Why has this understanding of meaning as psychological construct rather than cosmic discovery been so consistently suppressed or misinterpreted? Nietzsche identified what he called the conspiracy of consolation, not a conscious deception, but a multi-layered system that maintains meaning-seeking as the highest human activity, despite evidence suggesting it might be a transitional stage at best. This conspiracy operates through psychological, institutional, and cultural mechanisms that collectively prevent serious consideration of what might lie beyond the meaning-seeking impulse itself. The psychological dimension of this conspiracy involves what Nietzsche called the will to meaning at any cost. He observed how strongly humans prefer even painful or restrictive meanings over the possibility of no meaning at all. When people are forced to choose between a difficult meaning that requires sacrifice, like religious salvation through self-denial, and the possibility that existence has no inherent purpose, they typically choose the former, even when it diminishes rather than enhances their vitality. This psychological preference creates a built-in resistance to considering that meaning itself might be a construct rather than a discovery, making Nietzsche's insight threatening at the most fundamental psychological level. Institutionally, the maintenance of meaning as the ultimate human concern creates powerful organizational advantages. Nietzsche documented how religious, educational, and political institutions benefit from promoting frameworks that present meaning-seeking as humanity's highest activity. These institutions position themselves as meaning providers, gaining authority and influence by addressing a need they themselves help create and maintain. If meaning were recognized as a psychological construct rather than a cosmic necessity, these institutions' role would fundamentally change. From providers of essential existential orientation to optional creators of useful but ultimately contingent frameworks. This institutional self-protection helps explain why perspectives questioning the meaning-seeking impulse itself are so consistently marginalized or misinterpreted. The cultural dimension of the conspiracy operates through language and narrative. Nietzsche analyzed how the very concepts we use to discuss existence embed the assumption that meaning is necessary and natural. Terms like meaningless carry overwhelmingly negative connotations in virtually all languages. Cultural narratives consistently portray the discovery of purpose as the resolution to existential crisis, while meaninglessness appears exclusively as a condition to be overcome rather than potentially transcended. These linguistic and narrative patterns shape perception from earliest childhood, making the demand for meaning feel natural and inevitable rather than a particular psychological orientation that might be questioned. Educational systems further reinforce this conspiracy. Nietzsche observed how education typically emphasizes finding one's purpose, creating meaning, or discovering life's significance without examining the premise that existence requires such justification at all. Questions about meaning receive extensive attention, while the meaning-seeking impulse itself remains unexamined. This educational focus creates individuals skilled at constructing and evaluating different meaning frameworks, but lacking the conceptual tools to consider what might lie beyond the meaning-seeking orientation altogether. Perhaps most insidious is what Nietzsche called the moralization of meaning. By presenting meaning-seeking as a moral necessity rather than a psychological tendency, cultural frameworks effectively prevent questioning the impulse itself. Suggesting that life might be affirmed without cosmic purpose becomes not merely an alternative perspective, but a moral failure, evidence of nihilism, despair, or inadequate spiritual development. This moral framing makes critical examination of the meaning-seeking impulse seem not merely intellectually challenging but ethically suspect, creating powerful normative pressure to maintain meaning as the ultimate human concern, regardless of its actual psychological function. The result is a comprehensive system that maintains meaning-seeking as humanity's definitive relationship with existence, despite evidence suggesting it might be a transitional stage in development rather than its culmination. This conspiracy persists not primarily through conscious deception, but through interlocking psychological, institutional, cultural, and educational mechanisms that collectively prevent serious consideration of what might lie beyond the meaning-seeking orientation itself, the possibility that existence might be more profoundly affirmed without the demand for cosmic purpose than through even the most sophisticated meaning-making. The most disturbing aspect of Nietzsche's insight isn't just its implication that meaning-seeking might be transitional rather than definitive, but the systematic ways this perspective has been actively misinterpreted whenever it appears. His analysis of this pattern revealed not just disagreement with his position, but a specific immune response that operates whenever the meaning-seeking impulse itself is questioned. This pattern appears with remarkable consistency across different traditions and historical periods, suggesting not random resistance, but a predictable reaction whenever the psychological nature of meaning is recognized. The primary mechanism for this misinterpretation has been what Nietzsche called the nihilism projection. When philosophers, mystics, or spiritual teachers suggest that transcending meaning-seeking might lead to more profound life affirmation, their perspectives are routinely mischaracterized as promoting nihilistic despair rather than pointing beyond the meaning framework altogether. Nietzsche documented how consistently his own work suffered this fate, critics portraying him as celebrating meaninglessness as a tragic condition to be endured rather than recognizing his actual position, that moving beyond the demand for cosmic purpose might open the possibility of a more direct and vital engagement with existence itself. This mischaracterization serves a specific function. It maintains the false dichotomy between meaning and despair, effectively preventing consideration of what might lie beyond the meaning-seeking orientation altogether. By positioning meaning as the only alternative to nihilism, this interpretive move makes the questioning of meaning itself appear dangerous rather than potentially liberating. This false choice, either affirm meaning or embrace despair, has been the primary mechanism through which Nietzsche's actual insight has been rendered culturally unintelligible, despite its potential psychological and existential significance. Philosophical and religious authorities reinforce this misinterpretation through selective reading of texts, questioning the meaning-seeking impulse. Nietzsche analyzed how passages suggesting possibilities beyond meaning were consistently reinterpreted to fit within meaning frameworks. Zen teachings about transcending purpose get transformed into teachings about finding deeper meaning. Existentialist perspectives on moving beyond cosmic purpose get reframed as creating authentic personal meaning. This selective interpretation creates the impression that all significant philosophical and spiritual traditions ultimately affirm meaning-seeking as humanity's highest activity, when closer analysis reveals far more diversity and nuance in how traditions understand the relationship between human consciousness and purpose. Institutional mechanisms further enforce this misinterpretation. Nietzsche observed how academic and religious organizations consistently position perspectives questioning the meaning-seeking impulse as belonging to a particular philosophical tradition, nihilism, existentialism, absurdism, rather than potentially indicating a developmental stage beyond meaning orientation itself. This categorization effectively contains the radical implications of such perspectives, presenting them as interesting but ultimately limited philosophical positions rather than insights into possibilities beyond the meaning framework altogether. This institutional response prevents serious consideration of what might actually lie beyond meaning-seeking as a relationship with existence. Cultural reinforcement extends this misinterpretation beyond formal philosophical contexts. Nietzsche documented how artistic depictions, popular representations, and cultural narratives consistently portray characters questioning cosmic purpose as troubled, depressed, or morally adrift, rather than potentially indicating more advanced development. When films, novels, or other cultural products depict individuals moving beyond conventional meaning frameworks, the characters typically appear as tragic figures, rather than exemplars of more direct life engagement. This cultural representation creates a background assumption that meaning-seeking remains humanity's highest possibility, despite what might lie beyond it. Perhaps most troubling was what Nietzsche called the silencing of experience. He collected numerous accounts of individuals who, through direct experience, recognized possibilities beyond the meaning-seeking orientation, moments of extraordinary life affirmation without cosmic purpose, states of consciousness beyond the meaninglessness dichotomy. Yet when they attempted to articulate these experiences, they were systematically misunderstood, their perspectives reinterpreted to fit within existing meaning frameworks, or dismissed as temporary states rather than insights into more fundamental possibilities. This created a situation where direct experience that might challenge the ultimacy of meaning-seeking was effectively excluded from philosophical and spiritual discourse, maintaining the illusion that meaning represents consciousness's highest relationship with existence. This multi-layered misinterpretation has resulted in what Nietzsche termed the Great Misunderstanding, a collective failure to recognize the possibility that what lies beyond meaning-seeking might not be despair, but a more profound affirmation of existence than meaning itself could provide. The final question isn't whether life has inherent meaning, but whether the demand for such meaning itself reflects the highest relationship with existence possible for human consciousness. Nietzsche's revolutionary insight wasn't that we should embrace meaninglessness as a tragic condition, but that transcending the very dichotomy between meaning and meaninglessness might open the possibility of a more direct and vital engagement with life itself. What if existence needs neither justification through purpose nor resignation to emptiness, but can be affirmed precisely as it is, a pure happening beyond the human categories of meaningful or meaningless? What if the truly profound question isn't, what is life's meaning, but what becomes possible when we no longer demand that life have meaning at all? This requires a fundamental shift in how we understand human development. Rather than seeing meaning creation as our highest capacity, we might recognize it as a transitional stage, necessary perhaps, but ultimately to be transcended rather than perfected. Nietzsche called this possibility the innocence of becoming, a relationship with existence characterized not by cosmic purpose, but by direct engagement with life's unfolding without requiring it to justify itself through meaning. This isn't nihilistic despair, but might actually represent a more profound affirmation of existence than even the most sophisticated meaning-making could provide. The practical implications are transformative. Instead of the endless search for better or truer meanings, you might cultivate what Nietzsche called Amor fati, love of fate, an embrace of life exactly as it is, without requiring it to be different or to justify itself through purpose. This doesn't mean passive acceptance of suffering or injustice, but engaging with life's challenges directly, without the additional demand that they make sense within some larger cosmic framework. The question shifts from, what is the purpose of this experience, to, how might I engage with this experience most directly and vitally, without requiring it to have purpose beyond itself? For those caught in existential crises triggered by meaning collapse, whether through loss of religious faith, personal tragedy, or intellectual questioning, this perspective offers a revolutionary alternative. Rather than assuming your crisis indicates the need to construct new meaning, you might consider whether it actually represents an invitation to transcend the meaning framework altogether. Perhaps your spiritual and psychological development requires not better meaning-making, but developing the capacity to engage with life directly, without the mediating framework that meaning provides. This isn't surrendering to emptiness, but potentially discovering a more immediate and vital relationship with existence than purpose could offer. This understanding illuminates why certain experiences feel most alive, precisely when the question of meaning temporarily disappears. The flow state in creative work, moments of profound natural beauty, experiences of intimate connection, or physical exhilaration. These peak experiences typically involve not better meaning, but the temporary suspension of the meaning-seeking impulse itself. In these moments, we engage with life directly, without requiring it to justify itself through purpose. What if these experiences aren't exceptional departures from proper meaning orientation, but glimpses of a more fundamental possibility? A relationship with existence not mediated by the demand for cosmic justification. The transformation extends to how we understand freedom itself. If the quest for meaning reflects a particular relationship with existence characterized by the demand that life justify itself through purpose, then genuine freedom might involve liberation not just from restrictive meanings, but from the meaning framework altogether. Nietzsche suggested that what he called the overman isn't someone who has discovered better meanings, but someone who has developed the capacity to create values while simultaneously recognizing their created nature, affirming life without requiring cosmic validation. This reconceived freedom isn't arbitrary or relativistic, but reflects the highest possible affirmation of existence, loving it not because it serves some purpose, but simply because it is. For those who have practiced conventional meaning-seeking and found it ultimately unsatisfying, this perspective offers not despair, but liberation. Rather than assuming your dissatisfaction indicates the need for better meaning, you might consider whether it actually reflects the limitations of the meaning framework itself. Perhaps your spiritual and psychological growth requires not more sophisticated purpose, but the courage to engage with life directly, in all its inherent meaninglessness, not as a tragedy to be endured, but as the very condition that allows authentic freedom and creativity to emerge. The invitation is clear. Rather than continuing the endless search for cosmic purpose, you might develop what Nietzsche called the great health, the capacity to affirm existence without requiring it to justify itself through meaning. This isn't rejecting life's value, but affirming it on more fundamental terms, not because it serves some purpose, but simply because it is. The choice isn't between meaningful or meaningless existence, but between a relationship with life, mediated by the demand for purpose, and one characterized by direct engagement with the raw fact of being alive. Will you continue seeking the meaning that constantly eludes final discovery, or will you have the courage to consider that what lies beyond meaning-seeking might not be emptiness, but the most profound affirmation of existence possible, loving life not because it serves some purpose, but simply because it is? The real myth about meaning isn't that it doesn't exist, but that we need it at all. The path to the most vital engagement with existence might require not better meaning-making, but the capacity to affirm life precisely in its magnificent meaninglessness.